Dear learners, I welcome you to this MOOC on heritage tourism. Today we will be discussing the topic Infrastructure and Accessibility under the module Visitor Management at Heritage Sites. Let us begin. Accessibility in heritage tourism refers to a multidimensional and systemic condition that enables diverse visitors to physically reach, intellectually understand, and emotionally experience heritage resources in an equitable and independent manner through the removal of physical, informational, and social barriers while balancing conservation and visitor use, enabling people with diverse needs to participate in tourism with independence, equity, and dignity through appropriate design of products, services, and environment, which implies a barrier-free heritage sites, inclusive interpretation system, and an equal participation in cultural experience. While our understanding is restricted to physical barriers when it comes to accessibility, but it also is concerned with reduction or minimizing of informational barriers. For example, lack of knowledge, poor communication, and attitudinal barriers. While our understanding is restricted to physical barriers, accessibility is also concerned with the reduction or minimizing of informational barriers like lack of knowledge, poor communication, and also barriers which are attitudinal, for example, like social exclusion or lack of awareness. The current research trends argue that accessibility is not a separate niche but a universal layer across all tourism forms. Integrating accessibility into planning, conservation, and visitor management thus becomes the core of heritage tourism. Accessibility is systemic, spanning transport, site design, interpretation, and services. The key elements that the definition of accessibility include are physical access, which implies the possibility of reaching and entering heritage spaces; cognitive and experiential access, which refers to the ability to interpret, to understand, and to emotionally connect with heritage; design and planning dimension, which refers to accessibility achieved through thoughtful architectural and urban interventions, for example, itineraries or site planning, etc. There is a conservation oriented approach as well, which aims to ensure accessibility while respecting historical values, especially when there is tension between use and preservation. How do we understand accessibility in heritage tourism discourse? It requires moving beyond a narrow focus on physical access to a broader, more critical, and inclusive perspective. Accessibility as physical access. Traditionally, accessibility has been understood in terms of barrier-free infrastructure like ramps, elevators, tactile pathways, adapted toilets, and transport systems. In heritage tourism, this is often complicated by conservation concerns, where maintaining the authentic fabric of sites may limit structural modification. Thus, accessibility becomes a negotiation between preservation and inclusion. Let us try to understand accessibility as a sensory and cognitive inclusion. Accessibility extends beyond mobility to include people with visual, auditory, and cognitive impairments. This involves multisensory interpretation, for example, audio guides, braille signage, tactile exhibits, simplified narratives, and inclusive storytelling. Here, accessibility is about ensuring that heritage can be meaningfully experienced by diverse bodies and minds. Accessibility as information access. Tourists rely heavily on information before and during their visits. Websites, brochures, mobile apps, and signage must be clear, multilingual, and user friendly. Lack of accessible information can exclude potential visitors even before they arrive. This accessibility also means equal access to knowledge and communication. Accessibility as economic and social inclusion. Heritage tourism can be exclusionary due to high entry fees, travel costs, etc., or even elite positioning. Accessibility, in this sense, addresses affordability and social equity, ensuring that heritage is not limited to privileged groups. It raises questions about who heritage is for and whether local communities themselves can access and benefit from it. Accessibility as a cultural and representational inclusion. Accessibility is also concerned with whose histories and identities are getting represented. Heritage discourse has often privileged dominant narratives while marginalizing others. Inclusive interpretation ensures that diverse voices, whether indigenous, local, gendered, or minority perspectives, are actually visible and valued. This accessibility is tied to representation and cultural justice. Accessibility as rights-based approach. Contemporary discourse increasingly frames accessibility as a human right influenced by global frameworks like the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This shifts the focus from charity or compliance to entitlement, dignity, and participation. Thus, from the above discussion, we have seen that accessibility is not just a fixed standard, but a continuous process shaped by local contexts, technologies, and stakeholder interactions. What counts as accessible varies across sites and user groups, requiring adaptive and participatory approaches. According to Rickley and Hansen, accessibility can be best understood as a spatial, relational, an embodied condition that emerges across the entire tourism system, enabling equitable and meaningful participation through the removal of barriers and the co production of inclusive experiences. This definition puts forward a new dimension to accessibility as a networked system which is shaped by interconnected services. According to this approach, accessibility cannot be solved at individual sites but rather addressed at the system level and include the entire travel chain. It also advocates that accessibility should be co produced involving stakeholders, for example, people with disabilities in research and design, to ensure inclusivity. Another definition put forward by the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific states accessible tourism is a form of tourism that involves collaborative processes between stakeholders that enable people with access requirements, including mobility, vision, hearing, and cognitive dimension of access, to function independently and with equity and dignity through the delivery of universally designed tourism products, services, and environments. This definition adopts a whole of a life approach where people benefit from accessible tourism provisions. These include people with permanent and temporary disabilities, seniors, obese, families with young children, and even those working in a safer and more socially sustainably designed environments. Let us move on to understand the types of accessibility. Literature in tourism points out to a few categories or types of accessibility. For example, physical accessibility. This is the most visible form, referring to barrier-free infrastructure, for example, ramps, lifts, handrails, accessible toilets, pathways, and transport connectivity. In heritage sites, it often involves balancing universal design principle with conservation constraints. The other type of accessibility is sensory accessibility. This form is evident in the design addressing the needs of people with visual and hearing impairments. It includes tactile exhibits, braille panels, audio descriptions, sign language interpretations, captions, and multisensory displays. The aim is to ensure that heritage is perceivable through multiple senses. The third type of accessibility is cognitive accessibility, which focuses on making heritage understandable for individuals with learning disabilities, neurodivergence, or limited literacy. This involves simplified language, clear signage, storytelling techniques, visual aids, and guided interpretation that enhances comprehension and engagement. The fourth type of accessibility is informational accessibility. It refers to the availability and clarity of pre-visit and on-site information. For example, websites, brochures, maps, mobile apps, and signage, hours of visit, time of entry and exit, among others. It includes multilingual content and accessible digital design, ensuring tourists can plan and navigate effectively. The fifth type of accessibility is economic accessibility. It concerns affordability. For example, the entry fees, cost of transportation, accommodation charges, and associated expenses. High cost can exclude certain groups, So policies like concessional tickets or community access programs aim to make heritage financially inclusive. The next type of accessibility is social accessibility, which relates to social attitudes, norms, and institutional practices that may include or exclude visitors. This includes staff training, hospitality, safety, and the overall welcoming environment, ensuring that all visitors feel respected and comfortable. The next is cultural accessibility. This ensures that heritage interpretation reflects diverse cultural perspectives and identities. It involves inclusive narratives, representation of marginalized groups, and sensitivity to different cultural backgrounds, making heritage relevant and relatable. The next is digital accessibility. Increasingly important in contemporary tourism, this accessibility includes websites, virtual tours, mobile applications, and assistive technologies that provide digital accessibility to all the tourists. It allows both on site and remote engagement, expanding access beyond physical presence. In their paper, Accessibility of Cultural Heritage, Belanca and co authors have argued that accessibility should be understood not merely as physical access but as a multidimensional concept that includes sensory, cognitive, cultural, and economic access. They highlight that many heritage sites, especially historic buildings, present structural and conservational challenges that complicate the implementation of accessibility measures. However, they did emphasize that preservation and accessibility are not mutually exclusive and can be integrated. They pointed out that cultural heritage sites can be made more inclusive and accessible to diverse groups, particularly persons with disabilities, through thoughtful planning and design. Accessibility also refers here to flexibility in opening hours and the time required to visit sites, which should be clearly announced to the public as well in advance. Through this research, which focuses on historic sites in Italy, the authors have highlighted the case of infrastructural issues that could affect accessibility and the need for alternative solutions. However, they argue that accessibility at a heritage site should not be restricted to material adornments for utilitarian purposes, but rather about its historic value. In terms of designing and conserving heritage sites, practical strategies such as the use of digital technologies, interpretive tools, and adaptive solutions must be undertaken to enhance visitor experience without compromising the authenticity of the sites. The research concluded that accessibility should be treated as a fundamental right and a key component of heritage management policies, requiring collaboration among architects, planners, policymakers, and communities. Zygmunt Kruzek and co-authors in their research on the Krakow Museum have tried to examine how effectively museums in Krakow are adapted to meet the needs of people with disabilities within the broader framework of inclusive tourism and heritage accessibility. The study assesses 31 major and minor museums using surveys and evaluations of both physical infrastructure and digital accessibility. It focuses on different groups, including people with physical, visual, hearing, and cognitive impairments, as well as seniors and families. The findings revealed that Krakow museums are relatively well prepared for visitors with physical disabilities and older adults, with a high proportion offering features such as wide doorways, lifts, ramps, adapted toilets, and trained staff. However, the research showed that accessibility remained uneven across disability type. The study shows that museums are less equipped to support visitors with visual and hearing impairments, with fewer provisions such as braille descriptions, audio signals, and advanced assistive technologies. Structural limitations, especially in historic buildings, pose significant challenges to accessibility, particularly for wheelchair users, as architectural modifications are often costly or restricted by conservation regulations. With regard to digital accessibility, it was found that museum websites generally perform well in terms of compatibility and clarity, but fall short in perceivability and functionality for users with disabilities. Additionally, people with disabilities constitute only about 10% of museum visitors, indicating limited participation despite existing improvements. Thus, it becomes imperative to improve accessibility in order to address barriers, and there is an urgent need for inclusive design, better technological solutions, and continued policy attentions to ensure equal access to cultural heritage for all. The challenges to accessibility is multidimensional. In their paper Accessible Heritage Cities, Tin Duan and Hai Nguyen explores the challenges and opportunities of making heritage cities more inclusive for people with disabilities within the broader framework of accessible tourism. The authors argue that although accessible tourism has gained increasing attention globally, heritage cities continue to present significant barriers that limit full participation. These barriers are multidimensional, including physical obstacles such as uneven terrain and historic architecture. Informational barriers like lack of accessible signage or digital content, attitudinal barriers like limited awareness or sensitivity among stakeholders. So, the complexity of these issues is heightened by the diversity of accessibility needs across different types and degrees of disabilities. A key tension which is highlighted in this paper is a conflict between heritage conservation and accessibility. Strict preservation regulations often restrict structural modification, making it difficult to implement conventional accessibility solutions. As a result, the authors have emphasized the need for innovative and flexible approaches that respect both conservation principles and the need for innovative and flexible approaches. As a result, the authors emphasize the need for innovative and flexible approaches that respect both conservation principle and inclusivity goal. To address these challenges, the research proposes the use of assistive and digital technologies as a central strategy. It identifies three critical areas. Number one, the development of accessible digital platforms to provide information. Number two, the use of navigation system to support independent mobility. And number three, interactive interpretation tools to enhance engagement with heritage for diverse users. Achieving accessibility in heritage cities require a holistic approach that integrates technology, inclusive planning, and stakeholder collaboration. This approach positions accessibility not only as a social responsibility but also as an opportunity to expand tourism markets and improve the overall visitor experience, thereby contributing to sustainable urban and cultural development. Rousseau and co-authors in their paper Beyond Destination Accessibility, Tourism Infrastructure Across Mobilities, Technologies and Embodiments offer a conceptual rethinking of tourism infrastructure by moving beyond the conventional idea of accessibility as merely reaching the destinations. The authors here argue that tourism infrastructure should be understood as a dynamic, relational, and a multidimensional system shaped by interactions and mobilities. Mobilities meaning the movement of people, goods, and labor, and the technologies as well as embodied experiences. Rather than viewing infrastructure as a static physical elements, the paper adopts the perspectives from mobility studies and critical geography to conceptualize infrastructure as an active agent that shapes tourism experiences, spatial organization, and social inequalities. A key contribution of the paper is its critique of the traditional divide between material and immaterial infrastructure. It highlights how infrastructure is embedded in everyday life and intertwined with social practices, policies, power relations, and human senses and emotions. In this framework, accessibility is not simply about physical entry, but about how different bodies experience movement, inclusion, and exclusion within tourism spaces. Drawing from diverse case studies, the authors reveal that tourism infrastructure are co-produced through multiple forms of mobility and operate across different spatial scales. These infrastructures mediate access, participation, and transformation in destination, often reinforcing or challenging socio-spatial inequalities. This paper also introduces new conceptual tools such as transpitality, sensing, transit, and the infrastructural backstage to better understand how tourism systems function in practice. It ultimately calls for an infrastructural turn in tourism studies, urging scholars and policymakers to recognize the fluid political and experiential nature of tourism infrastructure in a rapidly changing world marked by crises and inequality. In the paper Enhancing Shared Street Accessibility in Heritage Sites for Individuals with Visual Disabilities, a Canadian Perspective by M. Lacote and co-authors, they have investigated how shared street design in heritage environments can be adapted to better support individuals with visual impairments. The authors highlighted that while shared streets aim to promote pedestrian friendly, inclusive urban spaces, they often create navigation challenges for visually impaired users due to the absence of clear boundaries between pedestrian and vehicular zones. These challenges are amplified in heritage sites where preservation regulations restrict structural changes and where traditional materials, such as cobblestones, can further hinder safe movement and orientation. Using a participatory and user centered methodology, the study integrates insights from people with visual disabilities, urban planners, designers, and accessibility experts. It combines co design workshops, literature review, and prototype development to identify practical and context sensitive solutions. The findings reveal the key barriers such as the lack of tactile guidance, insufficient auditory cues, poor contrast in materials, and environmental factors like weather conditions that affect usability. To address these issues, the paper proposes a flexible, modular design framework. Recommended interventions include tactile paving and guidance, paths, contrasting surface materials, strategic placement of street furniture, removable bollards to demarcate zones, and the incorporations of sensory cues to aid orientation. These solutions are designed to be reversible and adaptable, ensuring that they do not compromise the historical integrity of the heritage sites. The study also concludes that accessibility and heritage conservation can be effectively balanced through inclusive design practices and stakeholder collaboration. It emphasizes that enhancing accessibility in shared streets not only improves safety and independence for visually impaired individuals, but they also contribute to a more inclusive and sustainable urban heritage environment. Accessibility is a critical yet often neglected aspect of archaeological heritage management. Accessibility is not only a technical issue but also an ethical and social responsibility aimed at ensuring equal participation in cultural heritage. To address this gap, Heritage Site Accessibility Tool HSAT has been developed as a practical evaluation framework composed of a set of indicators. These indicators assess accessibility across multiple dimensions, including physical access, such as pathways, terrain, and services, and cognitive or informational access, such as visual, auditory, and linguistic communications. The tool assigns weighted values to different criteria, allowing heritage managers to quantify accessibility levels and identify areas needing improvement. The HSAT is applied to 8 case studies across the Mediterranean archaeological sites in regions such as Sicily, Malta, and the Balearic Islands to demonstrate its effectiveness. The findings have revealed that while some improvement have been made, such as walkway, ramps, and digital interpretation tools, significant barriers still persist, particularly related to uneven terrain and inadequate signage for visually impaired users and limited inclusive interpretive resources. In the paper Indian Regulatory Frameworks and Accessibility in Heritage Sites, a comparative analysis with international standard, the authors have critically evaluated how Indian laws and policies address accessibility in heritage sites in comparison with the international standards. It examines key Indian regulations such as the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016, Nation Building Code 2016, and the guidelines of the Archaeological Survey of India, and compares them with the international frameworks like the American with Disabilities Act, ADA 2010, and ICO-MOS charters. The findings reveal that Indian regulatory frameworks provide limited and fragmented provision for accessibility. While accessibility is acknowledged in policy documents, the guidelines are often general, non-specific, and weakly enforced, particularly in the context of heritage sites. There is a lack of typology-specific standards, meaning the different categories of heritage, for example, monuments, museums, archaeological sites, are not addressed with tailored accessibility measures. India's policy landscape provides a very essential foundation for advancing accessibility and inclusive in tourism. The Right of Person with Disabilities Act 2016 is the most significant legislative framework expanding protection and mandating reasonable accommodation across sectors. Its provisions directly influence accessible tourism by requiring inclusive recreation and adventure activities, accessible sports infrastructure, nationwide standards for physical access, accessible public transport, and inclusive information and communication technologies. Complementing this legislation, the Accessible India campaign of 2015 has accelerated on ground implementation by mandating accessibility in hotel approvals, developing 1,000 of accessible hotel rooms, promoting barrier-free monument through the Adopt a Heritage project, and integrating accessibility into major tourism schemes such as Swadesh Darshan and PRASHAD. The draft National Tourism Policy of 2021 further strengthens this ecosystem by aligning tourism development with sustainability, digitalization, private sector collaboration, and community participation. Its performance indicators emphasize infrastructure development, employment generation, responsible tourism, and inclusive growth. Together, these policy frameworks aim to transform India's tourism landscape into one that is sustainable, equitable, and accessible, ensuring that persons with disabilities and diverse user groups can meaningfully participate in cultural and tourism experiences. In contrast, international standards are shown to be more comprehensive, detailed, and enforceable, offering clear technical guidance and stronger legal backing. The bibliometric analysis further supports this gap, indicating that Indian research and policy engagement with accessibility in heritage context remains significantly underdeveloped compared to global scholarship. Some structural challenges in India include weak institutional coordination, insufficient implementation mechanisms, and lack of stakeholder involvement. These issues hinder the effective translation of policy into practice, thereby limiting inclusive access to heritage sites. India's regulatory framework requires substantial reform to align with international standards. It recommends stronger enforcement mechanism, development of context-specific guidelines, interdisciplinary collaboration, and participatory approaches to ensure that accessibility becomes an integral part of heritage conservation and management. From the above discussion, thus, we have come to the conclusion that accessibility in heritage tourism is a multidimensional and evolving concept, and it ensures that diverse visitors can physically reach, intellectually understand, and emotionally experience heritage with dignity and equity. While researchers have highlighted the ongoing tension between preservation and inclusion, especially in historic sites, it also shows that adaptive design, technology, and stakeholder participation can enhance accessibility. While the global frameworks emphasize accessibility as a fundamental right requiring holistic, collaborative, and context-sensitive approaches, studies have also shown how across museums, heritage sites, and archaeological sites have still persistent barriers. To mitigate these issues, scholars have advocated for digital platforms, navigation systems, and interactive tools to balance preservation and inclusion. With this, we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you so much.